Keeping things this way simply must not only be important to the West, but literally it must be the most important thing to the West. It's so important to them that they have always maintained this status quo no matter what else changes in the world. Wallahi, they're dedicated to the subjugation and the exploitation of. But we have to confront the truth, raw and unfiltered. The crimes that were committed by the West against the rest of the peoples of the earth are their crimes and no one else's. No one forced them, no one tricked them, no one controlled them, and we won't allow you to blame shift and put all the responsibility for your actions at the feet of other people, at the feet of anyone else, not the.
Hello, black brothers and sisters. I hope you're all doing fine now. White people are turning against their own governments to reveal the biggest secrets that they are hiding from black people, the exploitation of black people. Now, so let's watch this video, then have a quick discussion at the end of it. Thank you so much.
George Friedman, the geopolitical analyst, he wrote a book in the early 2000s called The Next 100 Years. Where he tried to sort of forecast what the world might look like in the year 2100. He began by talking about what the world looked like in the year 1900. And then he goes sort of decade by decade, how radically everything changed between, say, 1900 and 1930, or 1930 to 1950, and so on. And it's truly astonishing how many drastic paradigm shifts took place. Empires fell, empires rose, world wars, on and on. Really breathtaking global shifts. When you look at history that way, it's hard to wrap your head around how many changes can actually take place in a relatively short amount of time. Basically, within one person's lifetime, everything can change. You know, in 1900, like he says in his book, London was the center of the world. There was no communism, no Soviet Union. There was the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on. The Americans mostly stayed on their side of the Atlantic. And it seemed like this is how things would just be, you know, indefinitely. But just a short 40 years or so later, everything changed. England was demolished in the World War. The Ottomans were gone. The Soviets emerged. Germany took over France, on and on. Really radical, unthinkable changes. Then if you go ahead a few more decades to the 1980s, again, it seems like a completely different world. And then on forward to the 2000s, it's remarkable. Everything changed. And when you think about that, when you think about how many huge paradigmatic pendulum swings there have been that have taken place and that do take place in just a matter of decades, it makes certain continuities even more astonishing. When you're able to maintain a constant amidst the radical changes that sweep over every other element of international relations, global power relationships, international relations, and so on, when you're able to actually keep something unchanged, it lets you know just how important, how paramount it is that this particular status quo remains intact, how important it is to those who are keeping it intact. And I'm talking now about the West's relationship with Africa, because the West's economic relationship with Africa has not fundamentally changed in over 800 years. This is absolutely stunning. If the drastic and rapid changes that can occur and have occurred within the West over just 1 or 2 decades, if that's breathtaking, well, what about the fact that nothing has changed between the West and Africa in basically a millennium? I mean, the relationship was ruthlessly extractive 800 years ago, and it's ruthlessly extractive now. And you can't help but recognize that keeping things this way simply must not only be important to the West, but literally it must be the most important thing to the West. It's so important to them that they have always maintained this status quo no matter what else changes in the world. Wallahi, they're dedicated to the subjugation and the exploitation of Africa more than they're dedicated to anything else. Everything else is allowed to change except for this. This must never change. And it's not difficult to see why. I mean, it's the subjugation and the exploitation of Africa that has enabled the West to impersonate a superior civilization. It's like a con man, you know, a drifter who tries to convince people that he's some sort of an aristocrat or a monarch or something. Well, he needs to have some kind of a display of a monarch's wealth in order to be convincing. And that's been the whole basis for what the West claims about itself being superior. The whole basis has always been that they're materially successful. So, okay, today you have iPhones and technology, you have a high standard of living and so forth. So that means that you must be better. You must be more intelligent. You must be more evolved. You must be more civilized, more advanced. than the rest of us. I mean, look how nice their places are. See how much better their stuff is. Well, this is all reliant upon the vicious pillage and plunder of Africa. Without this subjugation, without this exploitation of Africa, Europe and the West would be nothing but crude, emaciated serfs, barely producing enough to survive. Their wealth was primarily derived from theft and plunder, from piracy and slavery, from mass murder and crime. This is just a historical reality. Because of the subjugation of Africa, first through chattel slavery, the extraction of Africa's human resources, and now through the extraction of natural resources, the West has been able to maintain this artificial, unearned status as a so-called civilization, keeping Africa subject, subordinate, suppressed, and impoverished is an existential need for the West. It's the only way that they can keep up the pretense of their supremacy. Because again, the pretense of their supremacy has never been based upon any actual advancement, any actual sophistication, any actual moral or intellectual development. It has always been based on the violent accumulation of wealth and resources, upon brute power, deceit, and conniving. And Africa, the subjugation of Africa, is the most vital necessity for keeping this con going. I mean, right now, the trade relationship between the West and Africa is that something like 70% of exports to Africa from the West are manufactured goods, and imports from Africa are just the raw materials used to make those manufactured goods. So they're taking from Africa what is needed in order to produce goods that then Africa buys from the West, made with their own raw materials. And the West has done everything possible to try to impede Africa's ability to build its own manufacturing base so that they could potentially use their own raw materials, use their own raw minerals to produce their own goods. I mean, the whole process should be done in-house. It should all be done in Africa. That's what makes sense. You know, you have the materials, you have the minerals, you can make the products. That's how it should be. Rather than giving your raw natural resources to the West, for them to manufacture and refine and process and so on, Africa could do all of those things themselves. I mean, imagine the impact that would have. Where would that leave the West then? Well, they know that. The West knows that. They're acutely aware of their actual total dependence upon Africa. If Africa manufactured, if they used their own resources, their own minerals, their own materials for their own industries, well, the entire economy of the West would collapse. And with the collapse of their economy, their whole so-called civilization would collapse. Africa is the foundation upon which they built their house. So they know this. And like I said, this is why no matter what else changes in the world, no matter how power dynamics shift in the world, the subjugation of Africa has been maintained for over 800 years. There's literally nothing more important to them than this. And this is why there are very powerful factions in the West that want to destroy BRICS, and why they fearmonger about Chinese investment in Africa, and why America specifically is engaged in non-stop interference, covert operations, regime change, regime infiltration projects all across the continent. I mean, look at South Africa, the ANC, either out of naivete or corruption, or naivete that devolved into corruption, or out of coercion, or some combination of all of these factors, the ANC collaborated with neoliberal programs for 30 years. I mean, to one degree or another, for the last 30 years. But as global power dynamics have been shifting, and the creation and the ascendancy of BRICS has been taking place, people have started to have aspirations. And more importantly, they've started to have options. And those options have made their aspirations actually achievable. I'm talking about aspirations of political independence, aspirations of economic sovereignty, aspirations of getting out from under the yoke of the West. That's actually becoming achievable now. So the ANC was facing, and they are facing, severe criticism and opposition. They were being challenged, and they were being challenged by parties that do not accept neoliberalism, neoliberal colonialism, corporate colonization. And the U.S. knew that eventually they were going to lose power. Eventually, the ANC was going to face the consequences of capitulation and collaboration, and they were going to be removed and replaced. And if the U.S. didn't do something, then the replacement for the ANC was not going to be an obedient client. Because again, South Africa has the option now not to be an obedient client of the West. I mean, as long as there were no options, then it wasn't that risky for America. Even if the ANC lost popularity, no matter who replaced them, they would have no choice but to capitulate to neoliberalism because there was no options. But there are options now. So you have the United States then backing the so-called Democratic Alliance, the DA, which is an overtly neoliberal, Western-aligned, elitist political party of colonizer collaborators. So the unpopularity and the opposition to the ANC opened a space for the DA to move into the government in the last election. So now you have this so-called GNU, the Government of National Unity, which is nothing but a neoliberalism light and a neoliberalism hardcore. It's a coalition of one party that was aligned with the West, the ANC, aligned with the West out of coercion or naivete or corruption, but which could have potentially been influenced by anti-neoliberal your history. You were responsible for the transatlantic slave trade that ripped millions upon millions of people from their homes, from their families, from their cultures, and you invented the whole concept of white supremacy to try to justify your barbarity, classifying your fellow human beings as subhuman. It was Westerners that raided that whole continent like savage beasts, chaining free people, packing them into ships like cattle, transporting them across the ocean to lives of unimaginable horror. Over 12 million souls were uprooted. Their lives were stolen. Their spirits were broken to build the wealth of the very people who were dehumanizing them. That was you, not the Jews. Even though you retroactively try to pretend somehow that the Jews forced you to rape and pillage Africa, that they forced you and your founding fathers to force Africans to work your fields and build your economy. That was all against your will, right? Every degenerate plantation owner had a gun to his head, didn't he? Jews forced him to buy human beings and treat them like animals. You were tricked into it, right? It was IPAC all along. And when the Berlin Conference was convened in 1884, where European powers sat around a table and carved Africa up like a piece of meat, the Jews told you what to do, right? The Congo was turned into a personal plantation for King Leopold of Belgium, where 10 million Africans were worked to death, mutilated, and murdered for the sake of rubber and ivory. I guess poor King Leopold must have been hypnotized by the Jews, yes? And every single vicious colonizer who inflicted that savagery on the Congo, I guess they were all forced or tricked into it by all of those.
Hello. Now, we've been seeing the problems caused by the Western countries to black countries. And we've been seeing this for the longest time, since when we were still being colonized, after we supposedly said we had the independence, and even after our own black brothers and sisters were shipped to their countries to be slaves. Now, exploitation of our resources in black countries, in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, in Africa, has continued. Now, under the watch of our own leaders, they haven't said anything. And as a matter of fact, they're the one who goes ahead to sign those contracts that do not even make sense in the first place. Then they award the contracts to these people. They have allowed the Western countries to still run the show in our countries. Now, it is time we black brothers and sisters open our eyes very wide, because if their own people can side with us, their own white people are now seeing the atrocities that have been caused by them to us. Who are we to be so much blinded that we even have the Stockholm syndrome, where we go ahead and side with the oppressor? Where did we go wrong as black people? Now, we've been seeing our countries being run by these Western countries. Now, if you go to West Africa, just an example, around 60% of those countries are being run by France. The minerals in those countries do not help the civilians and the citizens of those countries. Instead, these minerals are being used in France. Now, go to France. They have one of the largest gold reserve in the world. without a single gold mine in that country. Go to the US, they have one of the largest petroleum stores, barrels in the world, but they do not even have where they extract that crude oil. The extraction of crude oil is in fact made in the Middle East and in Africa. But why do you get them having such a large amount of petroleum in their country? It's because of the exploitation method that has been ongoing for the longest time. Now, oil was discovered in Jamaica 2 years back, but there have been so many lies about that oil because the government of Jamaica doesn't want the public to know the truth behind it. As a matter of fact, some even say the extraction of the crude oil has already begun, but the people are being told we are still doing surveys, we are still doing this, and we still have so many years. Just a few years back, around 2 years back, Jamaica and the US government signed some documents that were not disclosed to the people, where Kamala Harris, who is now vying for the presidency, said that the US is going to pump some funds to Jamaica to help Jamaicans. And you know, as well as much as I know, that the US has never given anything for free. The West never gives anything for free. All those aids you see coming from the West, they are not for free, my friend. All those ones must be paid for, by either blood, by the sweat of those people in that country. It won't matter to them even if people were to lose lives while you pay for the $20 million that you are being given. They won't care. Come to Africa. Congo, very rich in mineral resources. We have diamond in Congo. We have gold in Congo. We have coal, one of the largest coal deposits in the world in Congo. But the people live in absolute poverty. And do you know why? It's because when you are so brave and you know that we have gold here, we have diamond here, we have coal in our own country, you become an enemy to the West. And any leader who tries actually to safeguard the interest of the people or the interest of the public in his or her country, they try to eliminate such leaders. Where is Muammar Gaddafi? Just because he said the oil in my country will only be used here. Let the people benefit. We should not export our oil. This is whatever we've been saying all this time. If only all African leaders could be united and speak in one voice, the West could never have had a voice in Africa. You go to Mali, you go to Burkina Faso, you go to all these countries in the West, full of mineral resources, gold, diamonds, bronze. But whatever has happened is war, war, and war. You ask yourself, who do sponsor these wars? Because if someone cannot afford their basic amenities in their home state, how can they manage to afford an AK-47, which goes for around $5,000? You can ask yourself such questions, and who actually sponsors them, and where do they get the bullets when they run out of them? So there are so many questions, very pertinent questions to be asked. And we need to actually sit down as the people in the Caribbean, as the people in Africa, as Jamaicans, and see where our countries are going through. Today you might want to side with the oppressor. Tomorrow the oppressor will be after your life. There are so many gold mines in Africa. After mining, after extracting whatever they want from the underground, they leave those areas open. So many people have lost their lives. We are now experiencing earthquakes in Africa, which were not happening before, just because of the greediness that some people have, because they in their mind think that Africa deserves nothing, that we Africa are very stupid in that we can't use our own mineral resources in our countries, so they have to take it from us. It then exported to their countries, then it comes back to our countries highly valued, and the people in our countries still suffer from very, very silly things: poverty, malnutrition, things that we don't expect them to exist in the 21st centuries, poor shelter, and all these things that come with the atrocities that they have caused us. But we, the people in Africa, we, the people in the Caribbean, the Black Americans, the African Americans, the African diasporans, have refused to actually unite and speak as one voice to these issues. When you try to expose whatever is happening, your own black people come after you. They are now siding with the oppressor, and they do not want to hear. The West is the biggest problem we have in our black countries, and ignorance is the cause of that. We've ignored some people really ignore, and they think that the gold that is coming from Africa is not theirs, but it comes from your ancestors' land. This is why we are seeing Congo, Central Republic of Africa, on a crisis that has never ended. 40 years down the line, people are still fighting rebels. And who is sponsoring them? It's the Western countries. It's the biggest enemy to our development. We should learn and unlearn whatever we had learned. Time is here. Let's do it the right way. Thank you so much for having taken your time to watch this video. I appreciate. One love from wherever you're watching me from.